chapter 16. Chapter 16 opens up with talking about the Tax Reform Act of 1986, how it changed our nation's tax codes, laws, and I have a short YouTube video for you to watch with that. So, for example, you'll see on your slide that we have a married couple filing jointly. They're in that 25% income tax bracket. And we can take, through this mathematical process of figuring out interest rate, or that will be something that would be given to you if you're looking at it from a test standpoint, and break it all the way down to the $1,400 annual tax savings. And if the question is asking you how much per month, then you're going to need to divide that, of course, by 12. So if you're looking at this when you go to take your real estate exam, they're not going to give you a couple and maybe give you their earnings and then have you try to figure out what tax bracket they're in. They're going to tell you that they're in the 25% income tax bracket. They'll tell you either what their annual interest is that they're paying, or they'll give you the mortgage amount and the interest rate, which really all they did here was use this ERV formula because we're trying to figure out what the I is. We have the interest rate is 8% and the mortgage is $70,000, or we could say the loan amount. And you see on the slide that they're multiplying, and that's what we would do if we had it in our ERV formula. And you come up with $5,600 in the annual interest. Take that times the 25% tax bracket, and you get $1,400. And so you're taking $5,600, which is an annual number. You take it times your tax bracket, the answer is still going to be an annual number. And so if you want to figure out the monthly, like you see on the screen or on your handout, you simply divide by 12. Property taxes are similar in that sense that they can be deducted on your taxes. So we have our annual property taxes of $1,800 per year. In this example, they're putting the person in a 28% tax bracket, and we have a total of $504. That's going to be our annual number still, because if we're taking an annual number and in this equation, it's still going to, our answer is still going to be an annual number. So if they're asking for the monthly, we're going to have to divide it by 12. And this whole time, while we're year after year taking these off of our taxes, the house is increasing in value, or building and also building equity. So some of the benefits or appreciation in home ownership is that the construction and land costs continue to go up. Supply of funds and market conditions as well. The demand for housing continues to increase. Our populations continue to increase, and we have different needs for each generation. Depreciation. When we look at our personal residence, we cannot depreciate our personal residence, with the exception of a home office. And so there's an example on your handout where if we have a 6-room house and we use one of the rooms for our home office, then we can deduct 1/6 of the expenses due to depreciation, and we can deduct that. Other than that, our personal residence is not something that we can deduct. The next portion in your book goes over this capital gains, and there's a math formula that goes with it. Chances of you seeing a math formula for capital gains on your exam is pretty slim, but you will have to know these exemptions, and you'll also be able to use these in the real world. So you can avoid paying taxes on the profit or gain of your sale, or of the sale of your principal residence, if you meet these exclusions. And so, number one, your total gain cannot exceed $500,000 if you file jointly, or $250,000 on a single return if you file single. And some of the requirements are listed on the next slide. So the ownership is number one. You have to have owned and occupied that house a minimum of the last 5 years, or 2 out of the last 5 years. And you have, like number 2 says, for the use, it has to be used by you for 2 out of those 5 years. And you can't have used it on any sale during the past 2 years. So the number 2 is kind of the number to remember for these for the capital gains. So the loss on the sale you can't deduct. This can only be claimed every 2 years. And the gains which exceeds $500,000 filing jointly, or $250,000 if you file single, is going to be taxed as a capital gain. How do we figure out capital gains? Well, we have to figure out our basis. And our basis is our original purchase price plus improvements, which if you look on your handout, that's what we've done. You take the $85,000, which is that original purchase price, and you add the $8,500, which is what it costs to put in this family room, and that's going to be our adjusted basis, or they may just call it the basis. And then once we figure that out, we now take our sales price. Here in 2008, we sold the house for $128,000, and we subtract that adjusted basis, and we get a capital gain of $34,500. Nowhere near the $250,000 or $500,000 limits. So one thing to keep in mind when we look at this $8,500 improvement that they did on this house back in 1995, this is going to be an addition. They put on a family room. And so I had one student make the comment when I was explaining this that really anytime you're adding square foot or square footage, that's going to be something you could put into this formula. And I don't think that they'll have it on your test. They may, but the items that they would include usually in a story problem are going to be items that you would be able to put into this formula. So things like finishing off the basement. So at this point, I have an unfinished basement, so I have square footage that's not completed. When I finish that off, the cost to do so, I could add that to my purchase price and come up with my basis. In this example, they added a family room. Also, if they are going to, let's say, add a sunroom, maybe add a third stall to the garage that's already a 2-stall. But things like putting in new paint and carpet or fixing the roof would not be something that we would be able to add to this for capital gains. That's either cosmetic or wear and tear, just part of owning a house. So if you had to replace the furnace, it wouldn't be something that you would be able to add into this. In the real world, if you have somebody that comes up to you as a seller and is wondering what they can expect in their profits for their capital gains, your job is to refer them to either a tax professional or somebody that would be knowledgeable in that area. That's outside the scope of us selling real estate. So purchasing real estate, reasons for investing in real estate is, number one, we have that appreciation that we discussed earlier. Number two, we have what's called cash flow. And this is passive income because we're not going to be doing anything to make it happen other than purchasing the property. The rents are going to come in on a monthly basis, and we're just going to collect them. Equity buildup. The house continues to increase in equity as you pay down that mortgage, and you have a tax shelter as well. Primary purpose for investing is to generate income, and you have that long-term capital growth with limited risk. So I have a video that's going to show positive cash flow versus negative cash flow. So as explained in the video, we have positive cash flow and negative cash flow. Cash flow, just to define it, is the net proceeds after all the expenses, which makes sense. If I'm going to buy an apartment complex and let's say there's 24 units, after I pay all the expenses, including the mortgage, garbage service, taxes, insurance, all of those expenses, once they're paid, what's the money coming in from the rents or any other profits that come in from that, whether I have a laundromat on site or any other amenities like that? What is going to be the profit or the cash or net proceeds that comes in after all those expenses are taken care of? So you'll see on this slide example that we have income from an office building of $44,000. Expenses are $17,000. Our debt service is $18,000. And when I take out my expenses, I have a total cash flow of $9,000. When I turn it around, I look at negative cash flow, like the video was mentioning. This can be an okay thing. It could signify that you're paying down a lot of debt, or that you are increasing your inventory. So negative cash flow, we have tax-deductible expenses are greater than our income. By having this negative cash flow, we create this book loss or tax shelter, and that's something that you could see used on your exam. So we're going to have the same income on this slide, except we're going to have more expenses. Our expenses are going to be greater. We're going to be deducting things like our interest, and we're going to have some depreciation costs in there. And once we figure out our total cash flow, it's actually negative. It's negative by $2,000. So we have a book loss of $2,000. We have three different classifications of income. Our first one is active income, and this is from what we are actively doing. And so whether you are a plumber by trade or a dentist or brain surgeon, you have to actively do whatever your job or calling is, or your profession, to earn this income, and that's active income. So this really affects most people when we look at the professions that are out there. Portfolio income is income that comes from interest, dividends, and royalties. And then the passive activity income is what I mentioned earlier. That's money that comes in from our investments, our investment property, the rents that come in from those. Rate of return, this is going to tie in with our ERV formula that we looked at earlier. And remember that the bottom left of that ERV formula is rate. And it's always going to be in the form of a percent. So that's rate. That's our rate of return. And our value is determined by the income produced. Value equals annual net income divided by the desired rate of return. You'll see that on the second bullet point. You may see things like that on a test that are written out in a sentence type format. But if I look at my ERV formula, I can understand these sentences a little easier. So if I have my income up here and my value there, my value is determined by taking my annual net income and dividing it by the rate of return. That's going to give me my value. You could also say that my rate of return is determined by taking my annual net income and dividing it by value. Or I could also say that to determine my income, I simply take my rate of return and I multiply it times my value. It's just a way to say what we have written down in a math type formula and put it in a sentence. The greater the risk, the higher the cap rate, the lower the value. Some of these, when we get to the math, are going to make a little bit more sense. We have a math handout that we're going to do in a minute. When I take the future income and I convert it to give a present value, that's going to be the definition of my rate of return. Converting future income to give a present value. Converting future income to give a present value is going to be my rate of return. This slide shows the ERV formula, and then I have couple sentences written down at the bottom, which says the higher, or as the rate goes up, the value goes down, or the greater the rate, the lower the value. The lower the value, the higher the rate. Let me show you what that looks like. So this verbiage on your slide that says greater the rate, lower the value, the greater the rate. Up on the board, I have written this out, and it's really one of the few ways that we can actually explain it to you. And the reason that we're bringing it up is because it's something that you could see on your exam. So if you have a calculator ready, you can help me with this. I have the ERV formula written up here. I have $35,000 for my annual income and a rate of return, or we can call it a cap rate of 7.5%. Next one is cap rate of 8%, 9%, 11.5%. Throughout all four ERV formulas, the income stays the same. And in this world, let's just say that we have an investor coming to town. We're going to help them find a property, and they state that they specifically need to make $35,000 on their annual income. And so you find 4 properties with the cap rates where they're at. We're going to just do this exercise to show you where the incomes, I'm sorry. Who sets the cap rate? The cap rate is figured out through a mathematical formula. In the examples or the math problems that we use, where we look at a apartment building. So based on the total rents that come in, and we subtract out the vacancies, we add in any other additional ways that building makes money, subtract out the expenses, and that's going to give us a net operating income. And once we have the net operating income, which is going to be up here, we can take that and divide it by the value, and that'll give us the cap rate or the rate of return. So if when we look at properties, most of them have the cap rates listed, and so the higher the cap rate, supposedly the better the property, because we have a greater rate of return. For every dollar I put in, I'm going to get this much back. Now, just because you have a property like this one down here that says it has an 11.5 rate of return, you realize that a human being is the one that came up with those numbers. So it could be inflated a little bit, and so you want to make sure that you got the right cap rate. But just because you have a property at 7.5% doesn't mean that it's a worthless property. It could be undervalued. It may need some elbow grease, and the rents may be too low. If the rents haven't been changed for the last 15 years, well, I can go in and buy that property. I can raise the rents to where the market rate should be, and I can clean up the property. And so, yes, the higher the cap rate, the greater the rate of return. That's true. But just by looking at a property and just passing it off because it doesn't have the cap rate is something that you should avoid. You want to make sure that you run the numbers yourself and that you can see it as the investment that it should be, and then make a decision from there. So starting with this one, I have a $35,000 annual income cap rate of 7.5%, what would be my value? $466,666. About this next one at 8%. $437,500. How about the one at 9%? And the one at 11.5%. $304, $347. Yeah, 304, 347, or 304,000. You're right. So when we look at this slide, and when we look up here, we'll see that as the rate, see the rate gets bigger, 7.5, 8, 9, 11.5% as we look down. The value continues to go down as well. So we have 466 all the way down to 304,000. And that's the only, one of the only ways I can try to make this click, this concept of that as the rate goes up, the value goes down. As the value goes up, the rate goes down. Is when we keep that at a constant, or we keep the I, the income, at a constant. Now, chances are in the real world, you're not going to have somebody come into town saying that I have to have my income at 35,000. They're going to come to town and say, I want to spend, or I can spend up to $350,000 on a property. What do you have that's out there? They're going to tell you how much they can invest. So let's look at that real quick. So in all actuality, this is going to be a lot closer to the scenario that you'll find yourself in, where they're coming and saying, I can spend up to $350,000, find me some properties. And you find them 4 properties, and these are the cap rates. 7.5%, 8%, 9%, 11.5%, just like our last 4 that we did. So when we go to figure these out, because we're going to go across, let's figure out the income that would be generated on an annual basis from these properties. So the first one at 7.5%, my income is going to be okay. How about my next one at 8%? 28,000 even. $9%. And finally, 11.5%. 40,000. Now, on average, your cap rates in the market that we're in is maybe 8, 9, 10%. You might see something up to 11.5%, but that's kind of the general bracket that you could see cap rates at. So if I won the Powerball You see why I would invest in real estate? $350,000, and I'm getting $40,000 back on an annual basis. That's a nice salary. So it's a very good investment. So at this point, I'd like for you to take out the Chapter 16 math. Should have 4 story problems on it. And what I want you to do is work through the first 3, the top 3. The bottom one, number 4, we're going to do after we get through the next couple slides, because we're going to talk about straight line depreciation. So work through the first 3, and we'll go through them together. So in this Chapter 16 math, number 1, we got what? If an investor wants a 10% return on property that will produce a $37,000 net annual income, the purchase price should be $370,000. So we use the formula, put in our income, our rate of return, and we're going from top to bottom. So we divide. Number 2, if an owner paid $92,000 for her property and now wants to sell it at a 19% profit, what must the selling price be? There you go. So here's one way that we can do it. This is maybe a little bit longer, but if we take the $92,000 times the 19% for my profit, I'm going to get $17,480. So if I take the $17,480 and I add it to the $92,000, I get $109,480. Is there another way to do that? How do you do that? So 1.19%. So you could look at it as we have our 100%, which is the 92,000. We want to add the 19%. So it's 119%, or 1.19. And if we multiply those two together, we're going to get the 109,480. So you eliminate one step. How about number 3? A woman owns a building valued at $100,000. She wants a 15% return on the investment. What net annual income must be generated to meet this? $16,500. So we have our 15% on the bottom. We're going across, so we multiply. And we get 16,500. Before we move on to number 4, let's look at page 318 in the textbook, and it introduces this straight line depreciation. So when we look at our next slide, we learn that depreciation is an accounting concept for tax purposes. It estimates the future decrease in value, and we have 2 different lives. We have the useful life, which is the economic life that we can use this product, whether it's a vehicle or something else, and then we have the salvage life or value, and that's the value after that useful life has expired. And we use the straight line depreciation on investment property. Remember, we can't depreciate our own house unless we have an office. So on residential real estate, we can do it over 27.5 years. And on commercial or non-residential, we can do it over 31.5 years. And so this allows for an equal amount of depreciation over the allowable life of that property for tax purposes. So if you look at page 318, right in the middle, we have the address of 7007 Mulberry Drive. The legal description is Lot 3, Block 7 of the Falls Rapids subdivision. The land value is $32,000 and improvements are $88,000. And that's really how your taxes are going to look like. If you go onto the county website or you call down to the county office, they're going to have two different values. They're going to have the land value and then the improvement value, which the improvement primarily is the house or the structure that you've put on the land. And then when you add those two up, you'll see the total is $120,000. So that's the total assessed value for that property. And that's what your property taxes are going to be based on. So if we're going to depreciate this residential rental property over 27.5 years, because that's the time that we have been given for that, we're going to take the $88,000 and divide it by 27.5 years, and that's going to give us a total of $3,200. And so let's look at it this way. We have year one, and then this is 27.5 years later. And so I didn't fill in all the dashes for 27.5 years, but you get the picture. So by taking the $88,000 and dividing it by the 27.5 years, we get a total of $3,200 that we can depreciate each year. And so year one is $3,200. 2 is $3,200. 3 is $3,200. And I think you get the picture that over the 27.5 years, we depreciate that by that $3,200 each year. Now, you can direct your attention back to that Chapter 16 math page. And problem number 4 says Pete wants to take advantage of that straight line depreciation offered by the Tax Reform Act of 1986, or TRA 86. His residential investment property is assessed at $150,000 and the land is valued at $40,000. What is his annual amount available for depreciation? So I'll give you a minute to figure that one out. So, the assessed value is $150,000. And how do we get the assessed value? We take the land value plus the value of the improvements, and we come up with that number. We don't know what the improvement value is. We just know what the land value is, which is $40,000. And land does not depreciate. And that might be something that they could trip you up with on a quiz, is you can't depreciate out the land. So the total assessed value is $150. We know the land is $40, so the improvement value would be the $150 minus the $40,000, and we would have $110,000 for our improvement value. And that's what we can divide by the 27.5 years and help us to get that annual amount. Yes. So because they used the word assessed, we already have these two figured in there. And so what we need to do is subtract out the $40,000 gives us 110. When we divide that by 27.5, we get $4,000 that can be deducted over the course of the next 27.5 years. Leverage is another term that you'll see in this chapter. It's using other people's money or what you have in equity to gain more buying power. If you look at somebody like Donald Trump, they're a master of leveraging. If you listen to Dave Ramsey, who's a radio talk show host and has a lot of great stuff to say about finances, he's pretty much opposed to leverage. That's how he got burned. But either way, I wouldn't say either are wrong. I think it's more of what's going to fit you and your personality. So, but that's the definition of leverage. We have these tax-deferred exchanges. There's a video on our YouTube channel as well for these tax-deferred exchanges, talking about how the 1031 works. But really, for an exam purpose, it's trading real estate or like for like. You'll see in this area where we have farmers that have land that now is so close to the city that they're selling it off for development. And so they get very top dollar, high dollar for that land. And so when they sell it off, they just use that money, most of it, and they go buy more farmland. And those taxes are deferred because they're doing this exchange for like. And then we have our Securities Act. When we look at license law for South Dakota, we also define securities as well. And it's going to be the same definition, really. We have the 4 elements. We have an investment of money for common enterprise, undertaken for the prospect of profit, and the profits are derived from the management of somebody else. And because of this type of investment, we have security laws that govern this so that everybody that is investing in these securities knows what they're getting into. And so, check out this video. So, securities are this limited partnership or limited interest in a real estate venture. If you are in a real estate transaction where the property is being sold using a share or a stock instead of a deed that's being transferred at closing, then it's going to probably fall in the area of securities, and you as a real estate agent can't do the transaction. You're licensed to sell property that transfer through a deed, like condominiums, land, homes, commercial properties. But sometimes properties are set up through like a cooperative, like we learned about with condominiums and co-ops. And a co-op, when they sell the property, the buyers actually buy shares or stock within the company. And so if you are going to handle that transaction, you need to be licensed with the SEC and handle it, and it'll be handled much like a security. And so that's the primary difference when it comes to real estate in our world versus that. And so it is something that's valid. There is real estate that's sold using shares or stocks, and so that's why we are introduced to this concept of security. And so the last part of this securities is talking about the definition of securities. And when we think of securities, especially for the test, I want you to think of blue sky laws. We mentioned that already, but blue sky laws and securities, they go hand in hand. So these securities are speculative in nature, and just like if you watch the video, it's letting the public be aware of what they're getting into so that they know what they're investing in.